On a side note, I mentioned that I work in tennis, and of course, there's a big debate at the moment about on-court coaching, and will be allowed on the women's tour when the season restarts once the pandemic has passed. And it's divided tennis fans right down the middle. Some believe that it shouldn't be there, that the minute the player is on the court, it's just them and the opponent, and they figure it out themselves. And others thinking, actually, it's quite good because now we can actually hear what the coach is saying to the player at the breaks and at the change of ends. And it's fascinating hearing the language that is used, trying to encourage them, giving them direction. Do you think we'll see that more from a tennis perspective? We're going to see more on-court coaching, do you think? Let's go with Nick for that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think sport will constantly evolve, and I think largely what the tennis fan thinks is probably less important to what the players want from it. So some players will probably be quite happy that they're once they're on, they're the ones that are playing the match. They're the ones that have got to make the decisions for themselves. Others may want a little bit of support and advice. So I think it just depends on what the direction of travel for the sport looks like, really. So you could say the same will happen from a golf perspective, is that, would golf coaches be allowed on course at major sports events? I think the reality is it probably already happens without people knowing. There'd be, I'm sure, between the player and the box, there's signals and all sorts that go on that we're not aware of, that involves use of data going from coach or someone else somewhere to coach set up in the box inadvertently to players. Like, that's probably already happening. So all this is just kind of making it a bit more of a public thing, to be honest.
Absolutely. And that's actually a really good point, Sean, because we're seeing now how integral and how important a coach is to a team or to a player, aren't we? Now that in the world of social media and television and radio, the coach is, you know the coach's names now, whereas a few years ago, you wouldn't have known that person existed at all.
Yeah. I think that dynamic's fascinating with regards to tennis there, in the sense that on the face of it, the athlete is very much in control, or that's the perception that I see when I'm watching a game of tennis, and the player ultimately making those decisions. That'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of that dynamic, and whether or not the coach starts to play a greater role in influencing the outcome or the decisions of their athlete. And the dynamics there and that interplay is intriguing. A little bit like, I suppose, golf with caddies and the player. And the golfer. So yeah, coaches are very much in the forefront today. They, particularly within team sports, where you see them and talking about their decisions, talking about the performance, but ultimately it comes back down to the athletes. I think that goes back to coaching styles and understanding you as a coach and what type of coach you want to be. And when we talk about person-centered or player-centered, it doesn't mean that we don't use some of those traditional methods, because that might be what a player or a group of individuals need at that given moment. So I think, coaches have got to be thick-skinned, particularly as they start to, I suppose, move into those talent spaces where we're moving from that developmental pathway into a bit more of a performance and a results pathway, because you are in the spotlight a little bit. So this goes back to, as you work through your pathway, the importance of having good people around you, but also exposing you to some other skill development areas that you're going to need, particularly in that talent space that I'm sure probably Lydia could talk about in terms of now looking after a national age group team.
Actually, Lydia, do you want to pick up on that point that Sean's just made?
Yeah, I think, probably in the women's game, as the profile of it increases, there'll be an even bigger increase of kind of like availability of female coaches, and where you see it now, the Women's Football Show is a great example. Right after the game, they're now live with comments, and 5 years ago, not even 2-3 years ago, that didn't exist. So I think as a coach now, resilience is key. Social media has massive pressures. Not everyone's going to agree with decisions you make or things that you do, but being thick-skinned is so important, having a trust in what you're going after. And I think as a coach now, if I was going into a club environment, I think your vision and philosophy of what it is you want, knowing that, getting your players to buy into it is key, because then when you do have bumps along the way, you can kind of stay focused on what the end goal might be. So I think, you've got to be resilient, you've got to be able to adapt, you've got to be able to deal with those little pinch points of pressure and know actually who the right person to release to is in that moment. And that's where those relationships are key, because, with how big social media is becoming, if you let out that bit of pressure or pinch point to the wrong person, it could be suddenly all over the papers. So it's really important that I think you have good people around you that you can release to. But yeah, you're just ready for different directions of fire, and sometimes you're going to need a quick answer and you're going to need to deflect. But I think as a coach, you're always thinking on your feet in session, so it's probably similar in terms of a characteristic, but just a different dynamic now that the interest is increasing.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because now with social media, we do know who these coaches are, and they're having to do, as you pointed out, Lydia, having to do media interviews now, being on the radio and newspaper interviews and things like that. So that spotlight is going to get brighter and brighter as the years progress, for sure, in coaching. So let's round this up now. I'd like to ask you about what we call extracurricular activities. If someone's a young person wants to become a coach, what can they do outside of studying for a qualification, or if they're doing an apprenticeship, something that they could do that will look good to a possible recruiter or something on the CV? Let's start with you, Nick.
Yeah, I think it's probably been touched upon a little bit at the moment. The key thing for me is try and get as much experience in as many different places as possible. And that would be working in primary schools, it could be working in secondary schools, different age groups, disability, it could be talent pathway, it could be boys sport, girls sport, adults. I think the more you can get that breadth of experience, it will really help challenge and refine what you really love and find passionate about coaching the most, and will help you then settle probably into that place that you might want to work. My coaching now is with under 6 kids playing rugby, and it's fantastic. It's not in the talent pathway, and I'm comfortable with that because I recognise that it's not about the ego of the coach. My son's there, and I love watching him run around playing rugby with his mates. Don't understand rugby; it's a crazy game. But ultimately, what it is creating that environment for kids to fall in love with sport, whatever it might be. So that would be my top thing. Get as much experience in as many different sports, in as many different environments as you can, because hopefully that will then kind of generate where your real passion lies long term. And for us as an employer, or somebody that employs coaches in different roles, seeing people with a breadth of experience is going to be really, really important.
Just as a side note, when you mentioned about rugby there, Nick, something just popped into my head. I'll always remember listening to Danny Cowley, the Cowley brothers, of course, and he was talking about how in his coaching career he read books about different sports and the different types of coaching styles that are used in sport. And he mentioned about reading the book by Sir Clive Woodward about the Rugby World Cup, and he picked up so many tips from that book, and also met with Sir Clive Woodward himself, and who gave more tips and guidance and advice. And I find that fascinating that there are coaches out there willing to look at other sports and look at different coaching styles and adapt it to their own. So it's interesting what you mentioned there about rugby, which is a sport I don't get either, by the way. Sean, for you, what can somebody do to enhance their career prospects if they want to work in sports coaching?
Yeah, I think the volunteering angle is really important. There's far more opportunities in far more settings with lots of different audiences. So yeah, go and get that experience, as Nick was saying. I think there's something also about taking the time before and after your session to really make sense of that, so sense of what you've been doing or what you've been coaching. Going back to the idea of traveling an hour to coach somewhere, which I've done on many occasions, or if not longer, I often use the time driving there or driving back to think about what the session means to me, and to start to really hone some of my ideas and thoughts. Why I think that's important, so I don't think it matters what age you are. You have a voice, and you can share that. You can share your thoughts. It's understanding that in sport, and coaching is no different in terms of being full of opinions. But actually, if you come with those experiences and you come with that thought process, be inclined to share. So in terms of going back to networking, etc., be inclined to share. So I think events is a good opportunity as well. Volunteering in events, get close up to different opportunities, whether that be Olympics, whether that be World Championships, whether that be local events. Get involved and start to see the different angles, the different thoughts, the different ways of doing things.
Lydia, how important is volunteering for someone if they want to develop their confidence?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, if I was in the shoes of someone at uni now, I think the first thing I'd do is think about what it is that I want to move into from a coaching perspective, and then I'd try and seek out someone who's I can get hold of that I can offer to volunteer and almost become their shadow. Because I think from a confidence perspective, if you can almost see someone else going out and doing it, you can see them making mistakes. You're almost being a miniature version of them, and you're gaining loads of learning and experience from what you're seeing. But actually, one of the biggest things I learned in the 4 years that I was an assistant coach to senior football was a lot of things were brilliant that I could learn off the person I was working with, and some of them were learnings of things that actually, if I was in the same situation again, I might do differently. So I think from a confidence perspective, if you can work with someone and see them doing it, then I think it makes it feel more attainable. I think it gives you the protection that it's not you in the firing line in terms of making the decisions, but whether that's volunteering to pick up cones with a WSL first team, or going in to observe training sessions, or whatever it might be that it is you want to do. I think it's really important that you take that opportunity and use that to help develop your confidence.
Can I just jump in there?
I was just
going to jump in there. I think it's a really valid point that you can't go and consume every little bit of learning. So the important bit in terms of understanding where you want to go and where you want to get to and have someone to work through that is important, that you can start to get the learning that means the most for you. There's a danger, and I was probably a little bit like this as a young person around the sport that I coached. I wanted to know everything. It's just not possible. But having an understanding of yourself and where you want to go and how to get there, that then all of a sudden makes the learning and the opportunities around you more meaningful. So I just wanted to echo what Lydia was saying there.